This is the Page Publishing Book Club. I'm Alice Stockton Rossini. Let me tell you something about COVID, all right? It produced an endless stream of stories written by people who basically had nothing else to do because they couldn't do what they were doing. And a lot of them wrote books, like Louis Marini from the Bronx. He's a psychologist, so you can only imagine how busy he was during the pandemic. And while a lot of troubled people came to him, he was inspired to write The Faith, a Human Reality, a Divine Mystery.
I just retired 2 years ago, largely because of the COVID. I was a psychotherapist for 24 years, and I was inspired to author the book. One reason, because of all the people I ran into in the community and also in therapy with the fear, tremendous weight of what's going to happen to me, my family, my children. So because of these uncertain times, I said, let me start writing. I taught for many years, and I said, maybe I can help people and support people by writing a book on faith. Comes out of that height of the pandemic in the summer of 2020. I remember talking to people, whether religious or not, just worried about what's going to happen to them. What I tried to do, to make it simple, is that faith is a human reality, something that we all have. It's part of our DNA as a human being. Okay, whether we're religious or not, but for it to come to fruition, meaning to spring forth, we have to have relationships. Without relationships, there is no faith, as far as how I see it. And faith without relationships are really kind of shallow. They're just practical interactions with people. So whether a faith is human in human terms, which is non-religious, or religious, you need a relationship for faith to happen. The stories in the book are true that I encountered not only as a clinician, but in my previous life as a ordained minister, in listening to people about their lives and getting a sense of what's important for them, what gives them meaning, what gives them hope to keep on living. You have to have something that brings you forward, that you strive for. So the book basically is different experiences that I relate in the book to show that faith is possible for all human beings, depending if you are invested in it. Example would be when I was doing therapy, I had this middle-aged woman come to me. She parented her 2 children for 24 years after her husband left her. One of the children, 21 years old, was arrested because of a hideous crime, sent up to prison with basically a life sentence. And she told me in therapy, she said, I go see him every Sunday. The lady doesn't drive. She takes public transportation to go up to upstate New York, Poughkeepsie. And it takes her 3 hours to go and come back. And I say, why do you do this every Sunday? And she says, what he did, he deserves to be there, but I am his mother. I have the faith in that relationship as being mother, even though I cannot condone his behavior. That's why I do this. So faith is a drive that brings our humanity out to other people. Okay, she says, I didn't do this to hope he would convert someday, or I just did it because this is part of who I am and what I believe in. This is what a mother should do. That's what faith is about, in the sense of fidelity, support, friendship. Then in the book, to move it a little longer, I bring it into another dimension. That humanity of faith can be evolved and developed into a relationship with the divine, meaning God. Okay, so in the book, there's a progression through the chapters. Each chapter could be read separately, although they're all connected. You could and I advise that people read them individually because they're a little deep, not deep cerebrally, but deep emotional-wise. That take one chapter at a time, and then reflect on each chapter. Also has a chapter summary, which is kind of a help for people. But the whole experience of faith, meaning it is a movement, a permanent lifestyle toward the good for a human being. And other than I get into the divine, which is, what is your faith in the sense of religious, spiritual sphere? And the book I kind of used a lot in referencing it was a neurosurgeon, Eben Alexander, wrote a book on immortality and faith. And I kind of use a lot of his stories. He was afflicted with E. coli bacteria and affected his brain. He was in coma for 8 days. And he wrote a book called Proof of Heaven, A Neurosurgeon's Journey into the afterlife in 2012. Okay, that was my inspiration for writing how the divine affects our human experiences. So, what I say, faith is a movement where we don't expect things to happen for the good, okay? And they do turn out that way. We didn't plan it. It's not just kismet, it's not just coincidence because we did the right thing, either by our, showing justice to people, loyalty to people, being human to people. It turns out in a way we never thought of, but in a good way. On the other hand, faith could also be a power which we experienced during this pandemic, where we have to deal with struggling, hoping that we see the finish line. Because a lot of people used to come to me saying, gee, we have to survive this. We have to get through this, hopefully with faith. So whether one is a believer in God or not, there is a common denominator how faith can affect people's striving toward that.
All right, Lewis, we could use a little faith in humanity right now, couldn't we? David Mulholland, a professional actor, couldn't work during the pandemic, but he'd written a few plays over the years and decided to try writing a children's story. It's entitled Otto and the Not So Little Giant.
In the years of doing theater, one of the things I loved was when I had an opportunity to perform pieces that were written specifically for young audiences or for children. And when it all went away, I thought, well, I've got time. Let's try the book idea. And I thought, who better to write for than to connect with those kids that I realized I was missing, being able to have some sort of a connection or influence with. It's just so much fun. And kids are the most honest, open audience. And when you realize that sometimes it's the first thing they've ever seen, they shake with excitement. I mean, how much more could you ask than that?
So tell me about Otto and the Not So Little Giant.
Otto, like I said, came out of the time that I had to spare and decided to reach out to some kids. It is a story of a 7-year-old boy who lives in a village of giants, and he is a giant, but he stopped growing. So he is struggling in spite of a lot of love and support from around him. He struggles all the time feeling different and not fitting in. His best friend is a 6-year-old girl who's a year younger and twice as tall and deals with some bullying, but mostly it's a community that just loves him, but he's not so sure how he feels about himself. So through a series of adventures that he goes on in the book, he eventually ends up in a situation where he's the only one, because of his difference, that can save the day and rescue his best friend Lizzie. And doing that, he ends up celebrated as the village hero. And I guess pretty much learns that what made him feel different and smaller than everyone else is what made him special enough to be able to save the day.
Do you think you'll get a chance to stage it?
My only thought is I would love that. In fact, I even with the children's theater company I had worked with when I had mentioned the book, they said maybe we could adapt it into a children's show with music.
Oh,
I'm just trying to wonder how it could work when he has to be the main character has to be so much smaller than everyone else in terms of stature.
all of the actors have to wear stilts.
I like it. I've worked with some stilt walkers. I'm sure they would love the jobs.
Oh, I couldn't do it, but I bet you there's people out there who could. Wouldn't that be hilarious?
I know it would be great. Well, now you've inspired me.
Good. How are you telling people about this?
I did a little burst on Facebook and some social media to see what the response would be, and it got a really great response. And so as a result, there's been, some good sales so far, which is wonderful, and some good reviews on Amazon. And the ebook just is getting added right now, so that's fun. And I'll do another hit about that and see what happens. Have a friend who is connected to a library in the Hatboro area, and she said, "Would you think about doing a reading?" And I said, "I would love to do a reading. To be able to tell the story to a bunch of kids sitting around just like wide-eyed and leaning forward. What could be better? Maybe there's an audio book in the future too."
Go for it, David. Thanks so much. After working with troubled kids as a sheriff in Florida, Dave Anderson puts his thoughts and experience together on how to give our children a better roadmap and improve their self-esteem in his book, What's Really Cool.
I believe the mind is impressionable from age 0 to 7, and you have to instill positivity and good things. They have to see great things and hear great things. And that's how they develop and become leaders and a positive life growing up. The setting is in the classroom, and Miss Brooks, the teacher, a very positive and caring teacher. Jenny comes in late with her hat turned backwards and her hands in her pocket, and all the kids think that she's really cool. And this gives Miss Brooks a teachable moment, and that's when she shows Jenny and the class what's really cool. As Miss Brooks describes it, first she asks Jenny to take her hat and turn it around and take her hands out of her pocket, and then asks the class, is Jenny still cool? And the class says, yes, she's still cool. And Jenny asks Miss Brooks, what do you think is cool? And that's when Miss Brooks says, being courteous, do your homework, listen to your parents, and treat everyone with respect, and to be kind. With colorful pictures, because I want either the teacher or a parent or a grown up or even themselves to read it. Read it aloud, look at the pictures together, and learn from it, because growing up, you see parents argue in front of children. Children could be playing with whatever they're doing, and the parents don't think that they're listening or paying attention, but their self conscious hears this. And that's why we got to be careful within those years of what the child hears. And that's why I believe this is so important, to have positive things and also have them believe in themselves and know that they're worth it and that they could do anything they want.
Now, you're a former sheriff. Everybody knows who you are in town, right?
Yes.
Are you able to go into classrooms and read this book, or into libraries and share this book with kids?
Yes, I did in my town here. Even the mayor loves what I'm doing. While I was at the sheriff's department, I was in junior achievement, and I taught the troubled kids that had behavioral problems and grade problems.
Right.
By the end of the year, I had all of them with better grades and positive, and their minds were positive because they believed in themselves. Because a lot of kids growing up, they don't believe in themselves, but they don't know it. But if you work with them and let them know that they are worth it and do the right thing, they can turn around.
So true, Sheriff Dave. I'll talk to you when you're ready to publish that next book, all right? Jimmy Nowak ran a successful convenience store in the middle of Chicago's most powerful Democratic ward, and he was an umpire for 50 years. Already a very well-known and interesting guy, he shares his story, No Strings Attached, My Life Growing Up with the Birth of Rock and Roll.
Kind of interesting twist on the book. As you can see, I'm rather extroverted as we speak. Okay, every junior high and high school male should read the book because the first 5 chapters are so inspirational. I was terribly introverted. I was quite the precocious child, so I was reading at like a 6th grade level when I was about 5, and wound up having a Lutheran school agree to allow me to start school 2 years before I was eligible. And scholastically, that was fine. But until I got back from Vietnam, I was socially challenged. Never went to my graduation. Never had a picture taken with was bullied constantly. And the beginning of the book shares some of those stories. And the thing that was my constant companion during those very trying years was rock and roll music. I was a geek about it. And I was able to use that to fit in socially a little bit, okay? And after Vietnam, man, I burst that bubble and became this super confident, terrific athlete, very outgoing. As some of the police officers from my store shared with me when I was retiring, they told me, Jimmy, the thing that we're going to miss most is your storytelling. So I became the authority on Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and J.P. Richardson. I became an authority on the music of my generation, and I was able to use those experiences, including experiences of music we were listening to in a very unpopular war in Vietnam, and how that music affected me and so many other warriors who were deployed to Vietnam at the time. You will find stories about what it was like to listen to these rock and roll superstars as a 14-year-old, and then to spend gobs of time with them 6 decades later, and I trace how they evolved, how I evolved, and how the music evolved, and how it still remains the greatest music of any generation. I share a story about a particular rock and roll superstar who refused to sign an autograph for me, a disabled veteran, on Veterans Day, and how I shamed him into finally signing his John Henry.
Who was it?
I can't. You'll have to buy the book, Alice.
I have to buy the book. All right.
I contend that I reveal the person who was the inspiration for the movie The Sandlot. It's almost everybody's favorite baseball movie, and there's a connection with my history that reveals who that inspiration is. One of my favorite stories is about wonderful friendship with Brenda Lee.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
So you actually did get to know some of the people that you wrote about.
Oh, lots, tons of them. I was on the fence about who, if I was going to have a foreword written or not. And there's a gentleman who's like the top music impresario in the Northwest by the name of Ron Onesti. And Ron owns 5 big venues in the area. And he wound up writing the most wonderful foreword, concluding with some of the funniest remarks. His foreword almost makes the book that much more worthy of purchase. Finally, the whole concept of the book, the title, No Strings Attached. The book is the story about my relationship with this incredible guitar that I acquired at a Buddy Holly tribute. It now has 130 signatures of rock superstars, and their biographies are included in the book. And the journey that guitar and I have been on allow me to write the book like a history of rock and roll, and it almost serves as an almanac to detailing the homage that I created with it to Buddy, Bopper, and Richie, and also as a tribute to the music of the 50s and 60s. So, wonderful stories about relationships with Pat Boone and Brian Wilson, Dion, Darlene Love, and Ronnie Spector, God rest her soul. The stories are whimsical, they're poignant, they're just a relevant history of our pop and rock music culture from those times.
All right, Jimmy, thanks so much. Alexandra Sloan says, it's been an interesting and comedic ride moving from the New York metro area to LA and finally the woods of Northern California, where day-to-day life produced a lot of humor. Think Irma Bombeck as she talks about her book Cabin in the Woods, or how a kid from Brooklyn wound up with 20 acres of deer poop.
In my case, I was born and raised in Brooklyn, got married, and so things like septic tanks and wildlife. I had never seen a wild turkey before. So moving up here was quite an experience. When my husband and the realtor person were talking about, having to install a septic tank, and I asked, well, what is it? And they explained it to me. I said, you're kidding, aren't you? I mean, this is a joke.
It's pretty gross.
Well, gross and just, what do you mean this is what happens? I'm used to growing up with a sewer system run by the city. So it was an astronomical new venture in my life, certainly. And for the most part, it was a new adventure in my husband's life, because growing up in Los Angeles, you didn't have exposure to a lot of the stuff we have here either.
Up in Northern California?
Right. We live in what I would refer to as an urban rural area. There's an established town. Nevada City is one of the original gold rush towns from 1849, and that is what built the towns here. Exposure to all of a sudden looking out my window and there's a doe standing there with a fawn, or wild turkeys who actually, the females have a tremendous sense of humor. We have snow up here, very different from Southern California, and we have a banister on our deck out there that goes down 3 steps. They get up there and they slide on the ice down the banister.
The turkeys?
The turkeys. We've had a squirrel here that I named Evel Knievel because of his daredevil antics. I mean, he would just jump across the hood of my car, and then as I got, of course, it scared the life out of me until I realized this is one of his favorite games. And he'd jump across this thing and land in a tree, and I'd get out and yell at him. But of course, the more I yelled at him, the more he thought that was a gas. I've had wonderful, wonderful animal experiences here. But it's also, there is something in the book which talks about our son and dealing with his death.
Oh, my God.
And it's basically also, don't ever not have an opportunity. Make the opportunity to always tell your kid that you love them, because no one is ever guaranteed tomorrow. Not you and not your child.
You talk about an absentee husband. So you were dealing with this stuff by yourself, or did you have children?
My husband works in Los Angeles and will go down to do his shows. So a lot of times I was handling the house construction, raising our son, and dealing with everything else all by myself. And yeah, it was interesting. And I worked at that time. I found a job up here for a while and did work. But it made for interesting days. I used to work for ABC Television, so I'm planning on sending over to Good Morning America a batch of books, and I'm trying to talk to one of the local bookshops because I'm not a social media person. The whole Northern California area here, because we are close to Tahoe, is very bookshop-oriented. So when we go into Truckee, I've taken books with me and say, here, I'm a local author. Would you be interested in having this? So I've done that in several areas. I've done it in Murphy's and Ferndale, and a lot of the bookshops have all been very receptive, and they carry the book.
That's a great start, Alexandra. Thank you. A retired engineer who specialized in instrument design and nuclear instrumentation in the Coast Guard, Patrick Simmons volunteered to go to Korea during the Korean War, but ended up in Molokai, a very primitive place in the early 50s known as a leper colony in the Hawaiian Islands. He details his unique experiences in Survivors and Connivers on Molokai.
The Coast Guard had a navigation station on the northwest tip of Molokai. It was an extremely desolate, uninhabited place. So this group of Coast Guard men were pretty much isolated there. There was a road into the only town called Kaunakakai, but it's a very bumpy, dusty, and rather difficult trip. There were a number of rather unusual things that happened, including one of the men contracted cerebral spinal meningitis and was left on the base for quite a long time before he was taken to Tripler Army Hospital in Honolulu. One of the fellows, being very depressed after receiving a Dear John letter from his girlfriend in Philadelphia, climbed up an antenna tower and thought very seriously about committing suicide. The main character was my cousin. He and I were stationed at Elio Point, Molokai. He was a pretty adventurous, outgoing fella, much more so than me, and he was also a amateur radio operator and had an interesting conversation with a fellow who had leprosy and was isolated at the Kalaupapa leper colony. What are the chances of a person with leprosy being an amateur radio operator? Pretty remote. Plus, poor fellow was blind, and he had written a popular Hawaiian song called Sunset on Kalaupapa. What was even more unusual is Doug Malone happened to be sent down to the leper colony on New Year's of 1953 because the Coast Guard also had a lighthouse on the Kalaupapa Peninsula. And they sent Doug down there to repair the radio. And he tried to visit this fellow with leprosy, but guy was dying and they wouldn't let him see him. So because of all the unusual things is really why I wrote the book.
I think it's interesting that you say at the end, when Doug meets the leper, and he goes down to the leper colony, that he realizes who the true survivors are.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, when he went down to the leper colony in a very, very small plane, he sat right next to a leper, and he had come from the leper colony to the town to attend a funeral. Just completely unusual thing. The connivers were the officer and the chief petty officer that ran the small station. They were dealing in some of the Coast Guard property that should have been for the men on the station, selling things to a local storekeeper.
Man, this sounds like something right out of Twilight Zone, Patrick. What an interesting group of characters you got there. And they're real. Well, isn't that where the best characters come from, real life? And we got more of them coming up on the next Page Publishing Book Club. We got to run. Download the podcast at 710WOR.com. I'm Alice Stockton Rossini.